For 17 days, the world marveled at incredible feats of strength, determination, and victory achieved by the more than 10,000 athletes at the 2024 Paris Olympics. Now, as Paris looks back on the 33rd edition of the Summer Olympic Games and 100 years after the last Olympics held in the City of Love, we ask the question, will the estimated $10 billion gamble taken by the city to host the Games turn a rare profit, or will we see the same financial disaster so many other cities have faced in the aftermath? Following what looks like a largely successful hosting of the Olympiad, has Paris finally broken the cycle of crippling losses endured by most host cities, or will the city's big gamble backfire? Olympic Games can be enormous money spinners for the city and country hosting them, rating in $1 billion in advertising revenue, tourism income and sponsorships. Or they can end up a financial catastrophe, leaving cities with damaging legacies and massive debts, sometimes taking decades to repay. From the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Games corruption-tainted cost overruns, more than tripling the original budget, to the 2004 Summer Olympics in Athens contributing directly to the Greek financial crisis, and Tokyo's COVID-impacted Games disaster, leaving Japan with a $7 billion loss. Hosting the Olympic Games is notoriously risky. So how much of a gamble did Paris take in bidding to host the 2024 Summer Olympics? And now that the iconic Olympic flame has been extinguished, how are things expected to turn out for the city's bottom line? In this video, we analyse just how much of a risk Paris faced in hosting the recently completed Games. We'll unpack the numbers that made hosting them possible in the first place, how Paris got its funding, and what revenues or bad news France's capital expects to receive as a result. Welcome to Economic View, where today we'll be taking a deep dive into the $10 billion gamble of hosting the Olympic Games. Summer Olympics host cities more often than not end up losing money for hosting the Olympic Games. In fact, 4 of the last 6 Summer Olympics held this century have resulted in heavy losses for the host city, with only London in 2012 just breaking even and 2008's Beijing Games generating a marginal profit. Then there's the cost of hosting them. No modern Summer Olympic Games has ever commenced under budget. And while most mega projects and global events usually do overrun their budgets, the Olympics are famous for how far they exceed their initial anticipated costs and how much they end up losing on the bottom line. Even hosts who spent a fraction of other cities have netted huge profits, while big spenders have found themselves shouldering huge debts. We'll look at a great example of this a little later. Historically, hosting Summer Olympic Games has ended badly for the host city. While the first modern 1896 Games, held at a bankrupt Greece, were funded by an industrialist, later editions have been plagued by money issues, often leaving the host city worse off than before the event. In fact, if all spending on a Summer Olympic Games is taken into account, including the cost of upgrading infrastructure and indirect expenses, only the 1984 Los Angeles Olympic Games can claim to have made a real, tangible profit. So what chance does Paris have of breaking the Olympic money curse? Well, if history is anything to go by, not a good one. Back in July 1924, Paris hosted the Summer Olympic Games for the second time, after hosting the poorly organised 1900 Games, where many athletes were not even aware they were competing in the Olympics. Paris hoped to improve the second time around. However, many saw the 1924 event as a financial disaster. By the end of the Games, France had spent an estimated 10 million francs on hosting them, equivalent to around $1.1 billion today. In spite of the then record crowd attendances, it emerged that the city had earned just 5.5 million francs in revenues during the Games, just over half of what was needed to break even. The financial loss was immense. So why then, if Paris has such an awful track record, are they once again hosting the Olympics? Paris was awarded the hosting rights to the 2024 Summer Olympics back in 2017, after Budapest, Hamburg and Rome withdrew their bids, leaving only Los Angeles as the other remaining bidder. Eventually, with LA agreeing to host the Games in 2028, Paris was unanimously awarded the 2024 Summer Olympic Games. At the time, Paris's bid estimated that the Olympics would cost around $8.2 billion, far less than the three preceding hosts, Tokyo, Rio, or London's final price tags. But these cities overran their budgets by an average of 185%, and in a world grappling with higher inflation and increased economic uncertainty, Paris's price tag was likely to go up. By 2022, higher inflation led the Paris Organizing Committee for the Olympic Games to raise the budget by 10% to $9 billion. And by the time the Games kicked off, some were claiming that organizers had already blown past the $10 billion mark. Establishing the cost of Olympic Games during or immediately following them is notoriously difficult. Aside from the direct investments that go into hosting the event itself, countries usually spend more on upgrading or building local city infrastructure in anticipation of the increased visitor influx. This can all add up, resulting in direct and indirect costs that produce both long and short-term benefits for the city, region, and country. However, organisers often work with the government to use the Games as a reason to invest in things that were likely to be upgraded, built, or renovated anyway, making it tough to peg down a direct Games-related cost. But not all Olympic Games cost a fortune to host, and how much hosts spend on them doesn't always determine their success. Typically, the Winter Olympic Games are more financially successful than the summer versions. In contrast to their summer counterparts, 5 of the 6 Winter Games held this century have all turned a profit. Winter Games are usually much smaller, requiring less investment in infrastructure, and host cities often have all their facilities in place already, costing them far less than the summer versions, but not always. The 1960 Lake Tahoe Winter Olympics, for example, cost just over $800 million in today's money, going on to set the bar for how to turn the Games into a cash machine. While in 2014, Sochi spent a record-breaking $51 billion to host their Winter Olympics, with some estimates claiming a profit of $53 million, while others report losses. But we're analysing the bigger, more expensive, and yes, riskier summer games, like the one that just wrapped up in Paris. So how does Paris stack up against the other cities that have taken the Summer Olympics gamble? With an initial $8.2 billion price tag, the Paris Olympics was slated to be the cheapest summer event since the 2008 Beijing Games. So far, Paris appears to have managed to keep overspending down, with some analysts predicting around a 25% overrun. Since 1988, the typical cost overrun for cities hosting both the summer or winter games has averaged 122%, increasing to 176% for those hosting the summer games. But hosting an Olympic Games on a tight budget or sparing no expense to do it doesn't always translate to profits. Take the 2010 Vancouver Winter Games versus the 2016 Rio de Janeiro Summer Olympics. In 2010, Vancouver spent a modest $2.5 billion on hosting the Winter Games, a little over half of Rio's $4.6 billion initial spend to host a summer version 6 years later. While Vancouver netted nearly 30% or $721 million return on their investment, the Brazilian city endured a massive $2 billion loss. The Rio Olympics ended up exceeding the original budget by a whopping 352% of what was originally expected to be spent, following a series of corruption scandals and other controversies. But not all Olympic budgets missed the mark. The 2008 Beijing Games only went 2% beyond what was planned to be spent. Paris aims to break the tradition of spending big or extravagantly for these games. As much as 95% of the Olympic venues used in the games were already in place, with most only requiring light refurbishing. Rather than build entirely new facilities for events Paris did not have yet, organisers instead opted to construct temporary venues at a far lower cost, which could be disassembled after the event had finished. With 50% of the budget allocated to new sports venues and facilities, only 3 big construction projects were listed in Paris's initial bid. The Olympic Village costing $1.6 billion, a new aquatic centre for $200 million, and the badminton and gymnastics Adidas Arena at $150 million. Organisers also announced a series of innovative plans to cut costs and rein in excessive spending. For example, they ensured 90% of construction materials are reusable, they used circulated cold water instead of air conditioning, and they converted a rundown part of the city into the Olympic Village rather than building one from scratch. They also used student accommodation to house event police and firefighters. The remaining budget was used for operating costs to run the games, with the city claiming to have spent about $175 million on doing so themselves. Then there are also indirect costs associated with the games. Security, for example, is costing the French government a reported $350 million, while a mammoth project to clean up the River Seine, which hosted some water and swimming events, cost in the region of $1.5 billion. Elements like business disruptions, staffing overtime, cleanup, and traffic management all contribute to the city's overall cost of hosting the games. Ultimately, however, the true cost to Paris will never be known. So, where did Paris get all this funding? While most Olympic Games hosts rely heavily on government public spending to foot the bill, Paris is well supported. Paris's bid outlined a financing structure dividing funding equally between the public and private sectors. Of the public spending component, only 28% originated from the French state authorities. The city of Paris only contributed 3.8% in funding from their own coffers. Another 32% came through local, regional government and direct public funding, with the remainder sourced through large private sector contributions, with up to $4.8 billion raised privately by the French Olympic Organizing Committee and significant indirect income generated through tourism, increased spending and accommodation. Incomes are looking good for Paris. Much of the revenue is still to be tallied, but billions are expected in games-related ticket sales, advertising income, and tax. The city's value-added tax revenue alone from increased spending by the 10 million or so fans and visitors who attended the games means an anticipated $200 million in VAT charges expected to cover the entirety of the city's expenditure on the games. The International Olympic Committee anticipates that the Paris Games will have generated between $7 and $12 billion for the city and surrounding region by 2034. Not a bad payday for Paris. So how much did Paris actually spend on hosting these games? And will their financial legacy benefit the people of France or burden them with a debt they'll struggle to pay? While the recent Rio Games grappled with delays and corruption, and Tokyo 2020 faced an unprecedented COVID-19 delay, the 2024 Paris Olympics appears to have gone off without a hitch. And a great Olympic Games means an even better bottom line, or does it? After all, there's more to hosting the Olympics than just revenues. The global prestige that comes with hosting the Games, the opportunity to attracting millions of new visitors, investments in infrastructure, and leaving a generational sporting legacy are just some of the reasons cities are prepared to risk it all and host the Olympic Games. But did Paris's big gamble ultimately pay off? Only time will tell. Be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. And if you're interested in building an investment strategy to outperform the stock market, sign up to our newsletter where you'll get access to an exclusive course. Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.